Hi, I'm David Ellerton and welcome to the latest edition of Adult Radio. Today I'm going to talk about a country which is very close to Australia, culturally, racially and politically, and that's Britain. No other country in Western Europe has brought in as many non-white immigrants. Britain leads in this area and the remainder of Europe and the Western world follows, and that includes Australia. The Australian Labor government of Kieran Rudd followed the lead of British Labor. That is, both governments adhere to a kind of Marxism in their policy, what I call the new Marxism. I'll explain what this new brand of Marxism is later in my talk. Suffice to say, the new Marxism is the most influential ideology in the West today. Many academics, journalists, politicians, trade unionists, businessmen in Australia subscribe to the doctrine of racial Marxism. But Blair's government was the first to introduce it to a Western country wholesale. What Russia was to the old Marxism, Tony Blair's Britain is to the new Marxism. First off, let's have a look at the background of Britain's current situation. For 13 years, Britain has been controlled by a Labor government made up of left-wing baby boomers who were student radicals in the 60s and 70s. Many of the Labor ministers were Trotskyite communists, and that particular brand of communism has always been big in Australia and in Britain. Now Labor, under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, has abandoned old-fashioned socialism. Indeed, it has abandoned the white British working classes altogether. Instead, Labor has become the party of non-white immigrants. Under Labor, Britain has seen the biggest influx of immigration in its history. It's estimated that 3 million immigrants, most of them non-white, have settled in Britain under Labor. About 1.1 million immigrants are illegal. Only recently, a cabinet document from 2000 was leaked to the media. This document showed that Labor did have a secret agenda to introduce more immigrants to Britain and carry out a social engineering program which would change Britain forever. The document directed Labor politicians to sell this unpopular policy to British voters by making the claims that immigrants were good for the economy. Of course, it turns out that all those immigrants weren't so good for the British economy after all. It's now in recession with millions unemployed. But the British Labor Marxists were never truly concerned with the economic outcomes of their policy, only the cultural ones. The results of this Labor policy have been horrific. Since 1997, when the Labor government was elected, 1.67 million jobs have been created, and an unbelievable 98% of them have gone to immigrants. The population of Britain is at present 61 million, but because of Labor will go to 71 million by 2029. At present, there are 2.5 million British unemployed because of the recent recession, and about 1 million of those unemployed are aged from 18 to 24. If the economy does pick up, most, if not all, of the new jobs created will go to immigrants and not to British youth. This is all because of a left-wing Labor government which has been waging ruthless demographic warfare against its own people, particularly the white British working class. The British, particularly in the tabloid media, like to boast that they smashed the Germans in World War II and that they prevented the Germans from invading Britain in 1940. This period is considered by the British to be a great moment in the history of their country and in the history of British nationalism. The truth is, however, that Britain has been invaded by Islam, and cities like Bradford, Birmingham and Leicester are well on their way to becoming Muslim cities, part of a global Islamic caliphate. And although it's politically incorrect to say this, an Islamic occupation of Britain will do far more to change the British culture than a German occupation ever would have. Why has this invasion taken place? It's fairly simple. As I mentioned before, Labor abandoned the old Marxism. In old school Marxism, there was war between the capitalist class and the working class. The working classes would revolt and seize the means of production. Now, to our modern day Marxists, that view is old-fashioned. To them, the real war, the real conflict, is not between the classes, but between the Third World and the West. The West is wealthy and has extracted their wealth through exploiting, enslaving and genociding the coloured peoples of the Third World. Western countries, such as Britain, have bright and shiny supermarkets, clean streets, magnificent skyscrapers, bountiful farms, a working gas, electricity and a sewage system, clean water, roads without potholes, everything that the Third World lacks. The new Marxists want to redistribute the wealth of the West to the Third World. And they'll do that by bringing immigrants to the Third World to Western countries like Britain in the millions. Eventually, the white Western peoples of Europe, Australia, North America will be supplanted by the non-white newcomers. What will happen then? The Marxist ideology, all the races are equal. So the immigrants from China, India, Africa, the Middle East will do a great job of running the Western countries. They do just as good a job as the white man, if not better. The world doesn't need white Western man anymore. And a country like Britain doesn't need white British to run it. So that's the new Marxist doctrine. Now, it would be a mistake to think that a racial Bolshevik and cultural Marxist has to belong or to have belonged to an actual communist party. The new Marxism is, of course, deeply influenced by post-war currents in communist political thought. But more than anything else, the new Marxism is a state of mind. It's about an all-consuming hatred for the European white man and all his works, and a desire to give the peoples of the coloured nations their revenge. If you think it over, you'll see how widespread this new Marxism is. Think of the jubilation surrounding the election of Barack Obama in 2008. The new Marxists were ecstatic. Now at last a black man was commander-in-chief of the most powerful nation in the Western world. What's more, he'd do a better job of running America than the last president, Bush Jr., was a white man from privileged Yankee aristocracy. Similarly, the new Marxists were ecstatic when Nelson Mandela was elected to the presidency of South Africa in 1994. Last, a black man had displaced a white as the ruler of a country which was, in effect, a white Western country, a European country in the middle of Africa. Surely Mandela and Thabo Mbeki would do a better job of running South Africa than the whites. It was the same story in Zimbabwe in 1980, when the African Marxist Robert Mugabe was elected and displaced the evil white racist regime of Ian Smith. As for Australia, what Kevin did was exactly the same as Blair. Millions of Chinese, Indians, Africans and Arabs have always wanted to come to Australia. Historically, we never let them in, because we knew that over time they would displace us and supplant us. Then came Rudd, a vicious little man, who is essentially a Chinese nationalist and Tony Blair-style Marxist, and who, as we know, married off his own daughter to a recently arrived Chinese immigrant. Blood wanted to do a Blair on Australia, and he started doing that by allowing Chinese and Indians into Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney in the hundreds of thousands. The new Marxist revolution, a third world revolution, was to take place on Western soil. Australia would be run not by Anglo-Australians, but by a Chinese and Indian ruling class, eventually a Chinese and Indian working class as well. That would have been the fulfilment of Rudd's Marxist mission. The strange thing about the new Marxism is that it just doesn't aim at bringing the third world into the West. The new Marxism wants to bring the worst elements of the white race itself to the forefront. A people's culture reflects its values. And the first thing you notice about the British culture in the Tony Blair years is the rise of the yob, the chav. Popular TV shows like Shameless and Skins are about degenerate Britons who live in commission housing, who cavort with immigrant and Indian races, who could pursue lives of self-destructive hedonism. That reflects a change in British life, in British attitudes. In the old days, the term working class applied to British men and women who worked 8 hours a day in a factory or a coal mine. They were encouraged to improve themselves, intellectually and culturally, by attending working man's libraries, lectures on ideas and literature, and so forth. Many great British writers emerged from extremely impoverished working class backgrounds through this culture of self-improvement and self-education. Among them are Charles Dickens, H.G. Wells and D.H. Lawrence. Now, in the British media, in left-wing newspapers like The Guardian, the term working class is used to refer to men and women who don't work, who get their money from a disability or single mother's pension, who live in high-rise commission housing. As for self-improvement through self-education, well, you can forget it. Such attitudes are hopelessly old-fashioned. Chav culture, which idolises American hip-hop culture, makes a virtue out of hedonism, stupidity, lack of culture, and lack of intellectuality. It's a subtle change, but it's been brought about deliberately. Britain, as we know, has been dominated for hundreds of years by a restrictive class system where a man's life is determined by his accent. That's always incensed the Marxists, and let's not forget that Marxism as a doctrine was conceived by Karl Marx in Britain. The Marxists have argued that the British class system is unfair and immoral. The Marxists like to say that they're against the class system because it denies meritorious members of the working class the opportunity to advance up the social ladder. That's just Marxist bluff. Marxists hate the existence of privilege, full stop.